You are listening to a summary of Free to Choose, a book by Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman.
Nobel laureate and economist Milton Friedman was a significant influence on the monetarist and free market move to the right that began in the 1980s. Friedman was a great communicator, able to convince economists, politicians, and general readers of the sense of his theories. Decades after its publication and republication, this treatise, written with his wife, economist Rose Friedman, still serves as an accessible handbook for those on the political right. It is ardent but never heartless, radical but never blindly ideological. The Friedman's monetarist interpretation of the Great Depression proves especially interesting in light of recent history. Would Friedman have approved of quantitative easing? His criticism of the Fed in the 1980s indicates that he would have favored easing in principle, but the question of degree remains, yes, in favor of easing, but how much? Some of his issues, like inflation, may not apply at the moment, but many of Friedman's arguments still smolder. While always politically neutral, Get Abstract recommends this foundational read, the seminal text of subsequent right-leaning thinkers and their books.
Deflation in the 1930s. Many economists see the 1930 slump as the ultimate case study of the weaknesses of the capitalist system and as the original justification for Keynesian policies. Further study of the period reveals that the Federal Reserve Board's inaction contributed to the Great Depression more than previously thought. And monetary issues added to the Depression's severity. The Federal Reserve's failure to address the shrinkage in the number of dollars in circulation in the U.S. economy made the period worse than needed and turned a short recession into a long depression. The static that deflation introduces into the workings of the economy means that monetary shrinkage becomes shrinkage in the real economy. Prices are signals that help firms and individuals understand which actions and activities are profitable. If prices for goods rise, that motivates more activity and production. Falling prices slow activity and production. Actors in the economy may find it hard to distinguish between a fall in their particular prices and a general systemic drop in prices. Which is deflation? The monetary collapse prolonged and worsened the Great Depression by introducing a business climate that mimicked the conditions of a struggling uncompetitive enterprise, but for all enterprises at once. The static interference of deflation sent a bogus signal to businesses to slow down and shrink. Money can exert a distinct and independent influence when it gets out of order. The Great Depression. Chairman Benjamin Strong made the Federal Reserve Bank of New York dominant in the 1910s and early 1920s, when it led other Fed boards in managing monetary issues firmly. Strong's early death in 1928 left a vacuum. In the subsequent power struggle, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., resisted the assertive inflationary action that the New York Fed supported in the face of a recession. It now seems that New York was right. The Fed's overall reaction to that crisis was hesitant and small. In the main, it stood idly by and let the crisis take its course. In 1931, in response to Great Britain going off the gold standard, the Fed raised interest rates based on its worries about gold leaving the U.S. This concern seems perverse, given that the wider economy was on its knees. Later research revealed that America's gold reserves increased during this period. The Fed erred by raising interest rates and failing to take reflationary actions. Given the mechanisms of the gold standard, the Depression was an American-born problem, not a foreign import. If the Fed had followed the rules of the gold standard, it would have increased the quantity of dollars in the economy. The existence of the Fed as the lender of last resort gave larger banks a sense of security. Those banks did not turn to more extreme emergency measures, such as those that saved smaller banks in the 1907 crisis. Inflation in the 1970s. The Depression and World War II's dramatic stimulating effects seemed to vindicate Keynesian policies. The Fed and the U.S. government felt encouraged to contravene sensible monetary behavior in later decades. Now, even the whiff of a possible recession provokes calls for more government spending to check unemployment. Taxation is unpopular and bad for employment. The Fed's favorite options are borrowing and de facto money printing to make up the shortfall. The static mechanism, which caused damage during the Depression, could work in a positive way, with rising prices tricking businesses into thinking that their individual enterprises are competitive and that they should expand. But after a while, this trick fails to work, as executives become wise to inflation and build expectations of inflation into their behavior and contracts. Governments in the 1970s were reluctant to admit that printing money caused the stubborn inflation of that time. They tried to connect it to foreign shocks and other uncontrollable variables. The U.S. government's typical knee-jerk reaction was to impose price and wage controls. The experience of 40 centuries shows those measures don't work. Only the weak and unfortunate pay the price. Government monetary policy is the main cause of inflation, which is primarily a monetary phenomenon that reflects the quantity of money in an economy in relation to that economy's output. Special interests. The fact that certain groups' interests can elbow aside the concerns of other groups is a weakness in the U.S. political system. Powerful constituencies can lobby their way into the political process, producing results that run contrary to the general interest. These special interests form a highly motivated minority. Average citizens who don't feel strongly about issues at stake ignore the few dollars they sacrifice to the minority in question. Special interests find subsidizing lobbying entirely worthwhile if a sufficient amount of public money is up for grabs. Such lobbying represents pure waste for society as a whole. For example, professional bodies that claim to support the public interest when they campaign for strict professional certification processes are often only trying to limit the number of members of their own ranks to maintain the high prices they can charge individually. Trades unions can raise members' wages drastically while encouraging businesses to mechanize and downsize in response to higher labor costs. Although unions assert that they represent the whole working class, some of their actions end up benefiting only the best paid workers at the cost of the unemployed and non-unionized. Although economists have broadly agreed about free trade for decades, protection remains widespread. Struggling manufacturing industries, including those with domestic monopolies, can appeal to the government for protection from cheap foreign competition and increase the price of their goods. The millions of shoppers who each lose a few dollars, or the export industry that loses work because of reduced trade, prove unlikely to make a fuss. Special interests of all kinds often disingenuously mask their appeal in the rhetoric of the general interest. Reducing protected special interests encourages capitalism abroad. Rather than making aid grants to foreign countries' governments and thus promoting socialism, the U.S. should offer a more open trading environment, thereby encouraging enterprise. In a protectionist world, politicians inevitably get sucked into international tariff negotiations, which can escalate and cause disharmony. A free trade foreign relations stance is more objective and less confrontational. Big government. Thanks to the cumulative victories of different special interests and to mistaken Keynesian full employment policies, government now forms too large a part of the American economy. Society should limit government to handling only those activities it does best, keeping it our servant and not letting it become our master. When taxes get as high as they were in the 1970s, society becomes complicit in accepting tax avoidance behavior. The public loses respect for the wider government and for the authority of the legal system. Despite the repeated failures of well-meaning government policies to achieve their beneficial objectives, people often still see government as the solution to many issues. Programs that governments start with fine egalitarian intentions turn out to help only those members of the middle class who excel at the political scramble for funds. Increasing government welfare payments to the poor not only undermines and destroys the family, but also poisons the springs of charitable activity. Focusing too much on the equality of outcomes can stifle talent and hold back the chances of individual achievement. This perverse ethos might suggest that youngsters with less musical skills should be given the greatest amount of musical training. As government grows, its distant branches end up pulling in different directions. For example, one group of bureaucrats might focus on trying to reduce smoking, while in another building, other functionaries organize subsidies for struggling tobacco farmers. The market is the best protection. The growth of government and the triumph of special interest groups overshadow the simple truth that the market system protects and serves the whole community. Improvements in the life of the average worker since the 1800s are mostly due to capitalism's choice-driven mode of operation. Given differences in ability, inequality is inevitable. Under capitalism, positions of privilege are subject to continued attack by other, ambitious people. Governments have been known to make things worse when they try to regulate markets and prices. Trusted brand names and retailers' careful attention to the quality and reputation of their goods do more than government oversight could to regulate the excellence and safety of goods. When the oil shocks of the 1970s limited gasoline imports, the U.S. government's price regulations caused the ubiquitous outcome of socialist planning: long queues. Prices represent the market system speaking up and relaying important information. When government distorts this free speech communication system, aberrant outcomes, like shortages and surpluses, inevitably follow. The pharmaceutical industry illustrates how regulation can produce undesirable outcomes, albeit counterintuitively. Appointed regulators must be especially sensitive to even the smallest risk of a drug being unsafe, so they delay the approval of medicines that could help people. They also can miss or stifle items with great potential. The industry gets stuck with sky-high development costs and little incentive to tackle specialized medical conditions. Thus, the government does not serve the best interests of the sick. Desirable solutions. One approach to untying the asymmetric knot that special interests tie is to borrow from the United States free speech example and bundle all special interest actions into one big issue. This approach calls for adopting self-denying ordinances that limit the objectives that society tries to achieve through political channels. Rather than adjudicating the merits of individual interests, society should advance comprehensive guidelines that curtail government actions. Everyone sees special interest arguments through a different prism, so unanimous or objective conclusions are few. One person's free speech is another's hateful incitement. One person's selfish special interest is the crucial antidote another person needs to recoup the unfairness of historical circumstance. To close endless debates about which special interests are worthwhile, society should adopt a blanket rule: package all special interests together and abolish the lot. Take away the distortions and let the free market rule. Accept this area as an all-or-nothing proposition, like free speech. Without special interests distorting the economy and politics, government can return to being the umpire of the economic game and not the overstretched universal parent. The U.S. Constitution upholds the argument that even a government that is supported by a majority of the population should not unduly impose itself on the freedom of individuals by assessing coercive taxation for questionable government programs. If an elite did not have the right to impose its will on others, neither did any other group, even a majority. Government is democratic in terms of widespread participation but not in terms of majority rule. Given how special interests can capture the political system, additions to the Constitution offer the best defense. Passing an economic Bill of Rights would trump daily politics, protect public policy from the whims of passing administrations, and help in foster free trade. It would prevent wage and price controls, avoid undue limited entry to the professions, and simplify taxation. It would also impose rules on government borrowing and on the printing of money.